We have been discussing Arianism, the view that Jesus Christ is not fully God. And the last specific group we will discuss together with Arianism is the Iglesia ni Cristo. This is a very large group of people, a very large church, specifically in the Philippines. And they spread across the world in some ways. We'll talk about that in a little bit later. But just to begin initially with the history of the church. The church was founded in 1914 by Felix Manalo. Mr. Manalo came out of other groups and just over time was becoming increasingly more theologically innovative. Some of the early groups that he was part of were actually closer to Protestant, closer to Orthodox, and maybe even arguably evangelical at the time. But over time, as Mr. Manalo started to try out new ideas and just work through different concepts, eventually it developed into something of his own ideas. And enough then that he really separated it out as a different group or a separate church. In 1914, the church was founded. Mr. Manalo presided over this group for about 50 years. And then subsequently, the church was passed over to his son, Araño. He really focused on the international side of the church and worked at least to present the church as more of an international reality. He passed away or ceased leading the church in 2009, and his son, Eduardo, is the current leader. Very strong control from each one of these leaders. Each one of them have put themselves at the center of the church almost in a way that feels a little bit like a pope. And if you are sitting in on a service or some kind of proceeding with the Iglesia ni Cristo Church, you will hear them pray. They will pray specifically to God, to Jesus, and then they will pray in almost every prayer, they will pray specifically thanking the Lord for Felix Manalo and his ministry as a prophet. And then they will pray specifically for Eduardo. And that gives you this kind of sense that this leadership or these people, this family, is really at the center of the entire system. This family is a central part of this group. The group claims about 7,000 congregations around the world. The headquarters are in Quezon City, Philippines, so within Metro Manila. And the total congregants are they claim around 3 million people. Within the Philippines, the percentage, according to the Census Bureau, is around 2%, 2.5% of the population. So 2.64% would be affiliated with Iglesia. And that just in comparison to others, Islam is about 6%, and then Catholicism is almost 80% of the population. Just if you're asking people what they claim as their religion or what they would put down as their faith. A few other just passing characteristics before we move further in talking about Iglesia. They love to debate, and they'll invite it. If you get into a conversation, it's going to go that direction. They enjoy doing that. You will find a very interesting debate online between James White and a representative from Iglesia ni Cristo. It's a very uneven debate. It's actually difficult to watch. It's not really much of a debate. It turns into just more of, from the Iglesia side, just attacks that are really personal and not thoughtful. Mr. White, in his presentation, is very clear and I think does a good job. But you can see even from just that, you can get a picture of kind of the style that tends to be used. I would not really encourage you to have a public debate with an Iglesia spokesperson. And if it turns even in a conversation into kind of an abusive debate, it's best to pull away from it most of the time. They will say that they are very international. They will talk about churches all over the world. I question that. Actually, I don't just question it. I really doubt it. I don't think that's true. I think the reality is probably more like as you go about the world, you're going to find little congregations, enclaves, um, particularly of the Filipino diaspora. In other words, these are Filipino Iglesia members that then have moved elsewhere around the world. But in any case, in their advertisements and publications, you're going to see Iglesia presenting pictures, and there's going to be other races and other kinds, groups of people that are going to be featured prominently. And I think that's part of the intention to make this appear as an international thing. I strongly doubt that it actually is. Well, let's talk a bit about the theology and some of the details of what Iglesia teaches. They would deny the deity and pre-existence of Christ. And that is exactly in line with what I've said to you already, that this is an Arian group. And therefore, though they will talk about Christ, they will even talk about Christ in adoring terms. I mean, they will talk about him and in terms of great honor and respect and thanking the Lord for him. So you're going to hear language of Christ included in hymns, and some of the hymns are going to sound so close, exalting Christ, that they could almost be used as Christian hymns. In fact, there have been a few cases where someone accidentally took an Iglesia text and ended up using it as a hymn within a believing group of people. And that's because sometimes the wording sounds that good and that close. However, at the end of the day, if you really press or you ask questions or you pursue, you're going to end up discovering that no, they do not believe that Jesus is fully God. As Arianism always does, there's going to be some little distinction that makes him sound really close to being God, but not quite God. You're also going to find that compared to, let's say, Jehovah's Witnesses, their exegesis and their theology is not terribly well developed. I just mean by this that Jehovah's Witnesses have had more time. There are more resources, there's more involved, that Jehovah's Witnesses are able to develop some arguments that are just more complex. Where I think you'll find with Iglesia in general, the ideas are not clear. It's not even clear exactly what they're saying in order to explain some of the texts that I believe teach the deity of Christ. The core of their doctrine, though, and the reason I think this happens, that it's very simple in terms of theology, the core of their doctrine is personal. It's connected to the Manalo family. The Manalo family is absolutely in control of what's happening here. And that starts actually with Felix. That starts with the grandfather or the founder. Iglesia will teach that Felix Manalo is the angel that's represented in Revelation 7, 2, and 3. Revelation 7, 2, and 3 talks about an angel coming from the east. And so the link goes, okay, sometimes, and I'm not sure why this is around the world, well, the way that it's set up is that people will talk about the East as China, Japan, Korea, Philippines. Okay, so the Far East. So the idea is, okay, here, Revelation, it says an angel arising from the East. That's it. Okay. And so then the argument is based on this, he is prophesied in Scripture. Malachi 4:5 is another that works like this. It talks about the future Elijah. And you can see from other places, Jesus' words, that Jesus identifies John the Baptist as the Elijah who is to come. But there is some kind of ambiguity here of a future Elijah, that possibility in the way that you set up the passages. So the Iglesia group takes that opportunity and identifies Felix as the Elijah who is to come. And so what you've got here is something that's a little bit like Islam, in the sense that there's another prophet, an additional prophet. And in Islam, then you have all of the prophets and Jesus and then Muhammad. And in this case, then Felix Manalo is the new prophet. Of course, Iglesia does not believe in Muhammad, but Felix is the one who's the prophesied prophet. And therefore, Felix has this very exalted role in the theology of Iglesia as a declarer of the truth. As that works itself out then, because of his role, or because of who then he is in this exalted status, then the family has a very tight control on the theology of the group, a very tight control of what is said. And that means then that every part of their worshiping and their theologizing is going to be defined by the headquarters, or by ultimately the Manalo family. As I said earlier, you're going to hear Felix Manalo's name mentioned in prayer, not praying to him, but thanking God for him. And in nearly every prayer I've heard, he's mentioned like that. So is Eduardo, the present leader of the Iglesia ni Cristo. Again, as a way of just emphasizing and repeating that this family is central to their theology. The sermons that are distributed across the country, even across the world, those sermons are written at the headquarters by the church, by the central hierarchy of the church. And so that means that anywhere you go in the world, if you walk into an Iglesia ni Cristo church, they are going to all be preaching the same sermon on that Sunday. All of them. All. And again, it's a way of kind of uniting or controlling everything. Salvation is only through relationship with the Iglesia ni Cristo church. If you break relationship with the church, you lose your salvation. In that sense, some aspects of this are a little bit Catholic and linked into then, because it's got to be connected to the visible church. That reminds me of Catholicism ultimately. And a few more just practical points that are interesting. The Iglesia ni Cristo church teaches that you cannot eat blood, you cannot drink alcohol. Being absent from the church, from attending the church for any extended time, or having a relationship, a romantic relationship with a non-Iglesia member, any of those things I just listed are enough to face excommunication, meaning losing your salvation. And again, I think the idea of this is it keeps everyone tight within the church. Outsiders to the church are, you want to push those people away. Definitely not a romantic relationship. It's an internal, inward-facing type of thing. The Iglesia ni Cristo church tends to vote as a block, meaning the church will tell people how they ought to vote politically in elections. And so they control a pretty large percentage of the vote then. So if you have 2.6% of the population, politically speaking, I mean, that's a fairly large block. And that means then that the church has had a lot of political power. The church also will be internal in some of the way that they'll work with jobs or with business. So many of the people within the church will make sure that they only hire their friends or hire fellow church members. And the people that are in the church will try to attend or try to sponsor and frequent in Iglesia-owned businesses. So again, in a way, it becomes internal and even financial. Once someone's in the group, it would be really hard. Leaving the group might mean losing your family, losing your business, losing your job. And then, of course, the church will teach losing your salvation. It's a very strong sense of control once somebody is inside. Well, what are some practical approaches to them? Like every group, one of the core foundations is that you're going to have a relationship with people. You're going to have to develop a relationship over time. There's a very, very helpful, excellent testimony, video testimony online of a woman who was part of the Iglesia ni Cristo church. And at some point she became friends with an evangelical, was invited to her church. This was Green Hills Christian Fellowship. She was part of attending Green Hills Christian Fellowship and hearing the gospel, people talking to her, witnessing to her, sharing with her, relationships like that. And so over time, she started to move that direction. Well, when the INC church found out that she was doing this, they began to excommunicate her. They began to threaten her family. Her parents were coming to her and begging her to stop because they were going to lose their position in the church and maybe even lose their jobs because of, well, the church, how the church was pressuring her father as a result of her actions. That's kind of an example of some of the pressure that people can exert. Well, how are you possibly then going to be able to extract someone from all of that pressure? You're going to have to build a very close relationship with them. There's no other way it's going to happen. It's helpful to recognize that their members or INC members will be extremely ignorant of the actual teaching of Scripture. They will not own a Bible. Almost none will own a Bible. They're taught not to own Bibles. They're taught not to read Bibles on their own. And in fact, if you attend a church, you will notice no one is holding a Bible. No one enters with a Bible in hand. You wouldn't do that, and nobody is looking at a Bible. In fact, one thing that's really interesting just about the optics of a service or the optics of the way that someone would preach is that the person preaching will have maybe 5 or 6 different Bibles on the pulpit. And as he's proceeding, he'll pick up one and he'll read 2 verses and he'll set it aside. And a bit later, he'll reach over and pick up a different one and open it up and read 2 verses and set it aside. And later he'll pick up a different one and read 2 verses. And I think that is part of the optics of saying that reading Scripture and interpreting and understanding it is so complex because, look, I have to have all of these different translations in order to get it right. It's so complicated, and you have to know which translation to use at the right time. I think that's part of the optics of essentially arguing that, oh, you could never do this on your own. And part of that then, or for that reason, you're not going to see people carrying Bibles into the church. They're not reading Bibles themselves. How could you possibly do it? You'd have to know which translation to use. It's just a way of making the whole thing extremely complex. So you're going to discover then that people will not have a Bible and they will be extremely ignorant of the Bible. The sermons that you'll hear in an Iglesia context are not really that complicated, honestly, in terms of the theology they present. Basically, it's telling you, be a good person, do the right thing, be honest, make sure that you attend the Iglesia de Cristo church. It's kind of like that. Be a good person, be honest, and make sure you stick with us. I mean, it's not really that complicated, and there will be lots of stories, illustrations, and a lot of kind of guilt pressure to do the right thing. But that means then people don't really understand the Bible. There's no explanation, like an extended explanation of a passage, so much as it's just different ideas tossed out. And when you talk then to an Iglesia member, I would encourage you to just ask them if they've read the Bible. You already know what the answer is. They won't. They won't have read the Bible. They won't really understand the Bible. And they're going to answer something like, oh, I couldn't do that. It's too complicated. And I would follow up on that idea. I mean, when you ask them, hey, can I get you a Bible? Can we do a Bible study? And the answer is going to be no, we couldn't do that. The next question is, why would that be? This is God's words. God spoke to us. God has revealed himself. Why would we be afraid to listen? Why would God have spoken in a way that's too complicated for any of us to understand? Why is God like that? That he would reveal himself in such a confusing and complicated way. What you're pressing on here is a little bit of a, why is the church hiding this from you? Why is the church presenting Scripture as so complicated when it's God's words written to us? And I think pressing that might be a good way to introduce at least some questions in their minds. Who is the Bible for? Why is it bad for you to read it? Or can you say really that the group of which you are a part is helping you understand the Bible? Is it really helping you understand God's words better by telling you not to read it? Are God's words so dangerous that we, the humans to whom he wrote it, dare not read what he said? I'll just end with this as an interesting what I find is an interesting conclusion. If you follow up and explore or understand the way that the INC church is structured, you'll find some interesting characteristics here that are actually a close echo of Catholicism. That might sound a little funny because the Iglesia, or INC church, attacks Catholicism harshly. And it is really one of the ways that they have built their group is by constantly criticizing Catholicism. So over time, their goal, of course, is to win nominal Catholics, people who are just kind of Catholic in name, and bring them across to become part of this highly committed group. But I think the irony of it is that in so many ways, the church actually starts to echo Catholicism. You can see this, just looking at the picture of their headquarters. It looks like a cathedral. The church is, as I said, highly centered around the person of the Manalo family. And so it ends up functioning a little bit like a pope or a papacy. The theology is highly controlled, so much that people are not supposed to read the Bible for themselves. Only the church can interpret the Bible. Only the church presents what God really means, because you couldn't possibly do it yourself. It's too hard. Well, that's Catholic. The idea that no one can study the Bible themselves. We need the church to interpret this for us, to help us really understand what the Bible means. And the idea that you have to be very closely related to this group, this church. It's through your relationship with this church that salvation comes. All of those are kind of Catholic ideas. And I think that's fascinating because, as I said, the church has built itself on being a contrast or an alternative to Catholicism. But the irony is that it has itself kind of fallen back and created an almost new kind of Catholicism. I think that, again, tells us something deeper that's going on with religions and with groups. And it helps us recognize that there are certain patterns that repeat themselves across various groups. That once you move away from Scripture, you're going to see some of these patterns come up over and over again. If you're interested in studying Iglesia further, I could not recommend too strongly this book. It's written by someone within the Philippines who worked very hard to study Iglesia, interviewed Iglesia members, attended at Iglesia services, and just put a lot of research effort into truly understanding what they believe. There are certain ideas that go around about Iglesia, people talking about they believe this or say this, and some of those ideas are probably not true. Even maybe some people within the church believe that on a popular level, but the church itself has not taught it, and ideas like that. But if you will take the opportunity to understand it, and furthermore, and most importantly, if you'll follow some of the ideas we've talked about here, specifically focusing on Scripture and why the church would be pulling Scripture away from people, as well as some of the broader ideas about Arianism, I think that you and I could have good opportunities to share the gospel with people within this group.